to say about me. I love to sing and I love women.
By the time Dean Martin reached the final years of his life, the noise was gone. No late nights, no packed rooms. No one asked him to be charming. What remained was memory, not of applause, but of a time when his life felt steady, ordinary, and unperformed. Long before the suits, long before the Rat Pack, long before he learned how to smile without revealing anything at all. People often talk about the women Dean Martin admired, but admiration is not love, and attention is not belonging, because the woman who mattered most to him was not someone he met at the height of fame. She was someone he lost before fame taught him what it would cost. And once that kind of love is gone, everything that follows feels like imitation. Before he was Dean Martin, before the name carried weight, before audiences learned to expect a smile, he was simply Dino Crocetti, living a life where nothing felt guaranteed and everything required effort. And it was during this quiet, uncelebrated time that he met Jeanne, a woman who did not fall in love with a legend because there was no legend yet to admire, only a man trying to make sense of who he was supposed to become. They married in 1941, when success was still distant and uncertain. And together they built something ordinary but demanding. A family, 4 children, a home that relied on consistency rather than charm, and a partnership rooted in necessity, not glamour. Jeanne stood beside him through years most people never talk about, through small venues, unstable income, and long nights where rejection arrived more often than opportunity. And what bound them was not ambition, but shared endurance. With her, there was no performance required, no expectation to be entertaining, no audience to satisfy, only the steady responsibility of showing up each day as himself. As time passed and recognition slowly began to appear, the balance that once defined their life together started to shift, because fame does not arrive quietly, and the man Jeanne married began spending more time learning how to become someone else. The ease people later associated with Dean Martin was not natural. It was learned, practiced, and eventually used as protection. But that protection came at a cost. The ordinary life he once shared with Jeanne required presence, and presence became difficult once the world demanded something different from him. Years later, when people spoke about his many relationships, this one was often overlooked, not because it lacked importance, but because it existed before the spotlight made everything visible, and sometimes the love that shapes a person most is the one that ends before anyone thinks it mattered. When love began competing with applause. As recognition entered his life, it did not arrive as a moment, but as a gradual shift, the kind that changes a person without announcing itself. And Dean Martin began to understand that attention could feel like reassurance, even when it offered no real safety. Opportunities multiplied, rooms grew larger, and strangers started responding to him with admiration rather than familiarity. And in that transition, something subtle occurred. The quiet balance that once defined his private life became harder to maintain. The women who entered his world during these years did so after the transformation had already begun, when charm was expected and emotional distance was mistaken for confidence. And what they encountered was not the uncertain young man who once needed reassurance, but someone already learning how to withhold himself. Fame rewarded control, not vulnerability, and it encouraged a version of love that was lighter, less demanding, easier to exit when expectations became uncomfortable. These relationships were not without warmth, but they existed within a world that revolved around schedules, appearances, and public perception. And over time, intimacy began to feel like another role that required management. The ordinary rhythm of shared responsibility, the kind that once grounded him, had no place in a life where admiration replaced understanding, and gradually, the kind of love that asked nothing more than presence became unfamiliar. What made this period deceptive was how successful it appeared from the outside, because admiration can resemble fulfillment when viewed from a distance, and applause can temporarily silence doubt. But admiration does not challenge you to stay, and attention does not ask you to be honest when silence feels safer. As the gap widened between who he was becoming and who he once had been, the memory of a steadier kind of love remained quietly intact, not as longing, but as comparison. Later in life, when he spoke about relationships with careful distance, those who listened closely noticed that what he described was never excitement or passion, but ease, trust, and a sense of belonging he had not rediscovered. And without realizing it at the time, Dean Martin had already learned a difficult truth. Once love must compete with applause, it rarely wins. When the persona became protection. As his career expanded and the public version of Dean Martin settled into something audiences expected, the distance between who he was and who he appeared to be grew easier to maintain, and eventually easier to prefer, because the persona asked less of him than intimacy ever had. On stage and on television, charm became reflex, humor became insulation, and effortlessness became a carefully practiced skill, one that allowed him to stay admired without ever feeling examined. People mistook his calm for confidence and his detachment for ease, but behind that smooth exterior was a man who had learned that revealing too much invited demands he no longer wanted to meet. The more successful he became, the more useful the persona proved, because it offered control in a life that was growing louder and less predictable, and it allowed him to decide what parts of himself would remain unreachable. Relationships formed within this framework were shaped by it, never allowed to move past a certain depth, because the version of himself he presented was designed to entertain, not to be known. Over time, the performance stopped feeling temporary and began to feel necessary, not as deception, but as survival. And the idea of returning to a quieter, more exposed way of loving started to feel unrealistic, even risky. What fame provided was admiration without obligation, and that trade became tempting, especially for someone who had once experienced how demanding real presence could be. Yet the cost of this protection revealed itself slowly, in moments when silence felt heavier than applause, and privacy felt closer to isolation. He did not regret the success, but he learned that the mask which made everything easier also made certain things impossible, including the kind of love that required him to be ordinary, unguarded, and fully present. By the time he recognized this, the persona had done its work too well, and stepping outside it no longer felt like an option, only a memory of something that once came naturally and no longer did. The love he couldn't return to. As the years passed and success settled into permanence, Dean Martin's life began to narrow rather than expand, not outwardly, but inwardly, as fewer things were allowed close enough to matter, and love slowly became something remembered instead of pursued. The idea of returning to the kind of relationship he once knew did not disappear, but it grew distant, softened by time, and reshaped by caution, because real closeness now carried risks he no longer felt equipped to manage. What he had once shared required patience, emotional availability, and a willingness to remain still long enough to be known. And those qualities conflicted with a life built around movement, performance, and escape. The more familiar fame became, the more unfamiliar ordinary intimacy felt, until the two no longer seemed compatible. Women came and went, some offering companionship, others offering admiration, but none asking him to be fully present in the way that once defined his earliest partnership. And that difference mattered more than he admitted. He did not speak of this loss as heartbreak or regret. Instead, it appeared quietly in the way he described comfort, stability, and home, as though those ideas belonged to another chapter of his life rather than something still attainable. Over time, the memory of a steadier love became less about the person herself and more about the version of himself that existed within it. a man who had not yet learned how to disappear behind charm. What made this realization difficult was that nothing had gone wrong in an obvious way, no single moment to point to, only a gradual distancing that felt reasonable at the time and irreversible afterward. By the later years, love was no longer something he expected to rediscover, but something he acknowledged had already shaped him once and would not return in the same form. And in that quiet acceptance lived a truth he rarely spoke aloud. Some loves are not lost through failure, but through transformation. And once you become someone else, returning to who you were can feel impossible. What he admitted without saying it. In the final stretch of his life, when public appearances became fewer and the need to perform slowly faded, Dean Martin began speaking differently about the past, not with confession or drama, but with a noticeable restraint that suggested certain thoughts had been settled long ago. He did not single out names or recount moments in detail, yet when he spoke about happiness, his language shifted toward simplicity rather than excitement, toward steadiness rather than passion, as though the qualities he valued most no longer belonged to the life he was living. Those closest to him noticed that his reflections returned repeatedly to ideas of normalcy and quiet, not as complaints, but as acknowledgments of something that once existed and no longer did. There was no bitterness in this, only a recognition that some forms of love belong to a specific version of oneself, and once that version passes, the love cannot be reclaimed in the same way. What he seemed to understand late in life was that the woman he truly loved was inseparable from the man he used to be, and that separating the two had been the cost of becoming someone admired by millions. He did not describe this as a mistake, perhaps because doing so would have required revisiting choices that had already shaped an entire lifetime. But the absence of regret did not mean the absence of understanding. Instead, his acceptance carried a quieter weight, the kind that comes from realizing that success can fulfill ambition while leaving deeper needs unresolved. In these moments, it became clear that what he missed was not a relationship to return to, but a sense of belonging that had once felt natural and unguarded. By then, he no longer expected to recover it, only to acknowledge its significance, and that acknowledgement, spoken carefully and without sentimentality, revealed more about his deepest affection than any public declaration ever could. The one he measured life against. By the time his life reached its final chapter, the question of love was no longer something Dean Martin tried to solve, but something he quietly understood, because the answer had been with him for decades, shaping his choices even when he pretended not to notice. The woman he truly loved was never part of his later life, never present during the years of greatest recognition, and never spoken of in ways that invited attention. Yet her absence defined the emotional limits of everything that followed. She represented a period before performance became instinct, before charm replaced honesty, and before distance felt safer than closeness. And that contrast stayed with him long after the relationship itself had ended. Every version of companionship that came later was measured, consciously or not, against the memory of a love that required no role and asked no explanation, and none of them quite reached it. This did not make his later life empty, but it did make it narrower, shaped by boundaries he had learned to protect himself with, and those boundaries rarely moved once they were in place. What he came to understand, too late to change but early enough to accept, was that love is not only about who you choose, but about who you allow yourself to remain. And once you become someone else for long enough, returning feels unnatural. His realization was not dramatic, not filled with remorse, but steady and clear, as though he had finally named something he had always known. In the end, the woman he truly loved was not defined by how the story ended, but by how deeply it marked him. And that mark remained long after the applause faded. Some loves do not stay, and some lives do not allow them to, but the measure of their importance is found in what nothing else ever replaces: when the noise finally stops. In the end, Dean Martin's life reminds us that love is not always defined by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it shapes who we become. Fame gave him comfort, admiration, and distance, yet the love that stayed with him belonged to a quieter time, before applause replaced presence and success demanded performance. He did not speak of this with regret, only with understanding, as though he had finally accepted the cost of becoming who the world wanted him to be. Many of us recognize this truth in our own lives, because love is often lost not through drama, but through slow change. If this story feels familiar, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you value stories told with respect and honesty, consider subscribing and stay with us for the next chapter.